for a community that cares for one another and that cares for this wider world. I give thanks today. Amen. Now, when he was 28 years old, Alexander Argyles concluded that he knew too many languages. It was 2001, and he had just returned to South Korea from St. Petersburg, where he had taken lessons in Russian with a private tutor for 6 hours a day for several months. So Ian Leslie tells us in his book, Curious, the desire to know and why your life depends upon it. Leslie writes that by the time Alexander Argyles left St. Petersburg, he was able to hold his own with native Russian speakers. But that was only the most recent in a long time exploration of languages. Ever since he was a boy, he had been fascinated by languages and the worlds that each language seemed to open up to him. In part, this came from his upbringing. His father was self-taught and switched effortlessly between 5 or 6 different languages. Now, by the time Alexander reached college, he was speaking and reading French. He was reading Latin, ancient Greek, and Sanskrit. He did his graduate work in Old French, Old German, Old English, and Norse. There is no secret, he said. It takes hours of concentration. Another noteworthy thing that he said, he found that he had to develop something of a new personality. Naturally reticent, he had to force himself to have conversations that he otherwise would have avoided with the natives of the languages that he was learning. This proximity to others was the cost of opening up these new worlds, of having them reveal their secrets. Now, last night I had a terrible worry about this service. Initially, I had thought that the theme of the sermon, which is tolerance, would fit really well with Riley's song. And I still think it does. My take on a piece of my mind is that it is about the large existential questions that we humans ask ourselves. And living with the diversity of answers to those questions opens up the need for tolerance. That is largely what I plan to talk about today. But late on Saturday night, I wondered if there wasn't a sideways meaning that I had not at all intended, provoked by Riley's genre. Just to be clear, this is not a sermon about whether or not we should tolerate different forms of music like rap. I, for one, appreciate and enjoy the wide diversity of genres that we bring into this space Sunday after Sunday, and I am particularly enthusiastic to get to welcome Riley here this morning to perform for us. Yep. We are celebrating the 450th anniversary of the Edict of Torda this week. And that sounds like a godforsaken and boring topic, but I believe that it actually has a lot of life and relevance today. The Edict of Torda was the first of its kind in the history of the West. Basically, up until the point that it was issued, most countries fell under the rule of a Catholic monarch, and the presumed faith of all citizens of that country was Catholic. During the Reformation, a few countries had their rulers convert to Lutheranism or to Calvinism, and then with them, the whole country overnight would be converted as well. Imagine that for a moment. One day you go to bed with a certain faith, the one that you grew up with, and the next day you learn that your country's leader has switched denominations, and you have to change your religion as well. The idea is thankfully a foreign and nearly incomprehensible one to us. But this is the way of the world during the Protestant Reformation. You followed the faith of your king. One king, one law, one religion was the way that it was worded in France, except, it was in French. So this is the context in which John Sigismund lived. He was destined to become the monarch of Transylvania. And during his reign, preachers of Lutheranism and Calvinism and Unitarianism came to the traditionally Catholic Transylvania. And because it was a period of Reformation, Sigismund decided to see who could convince him of their stance. So he hosted what may well have been the first ever ecumenical preach-off, where dozens of preachers flooded into his court and tried to convince him of their position. Now, I imagine this in my own, internal imaginings as a lot like an old school American Idol where there was no music and people were talking about Jesus. The Unitarian orator Francis David won the day, and Sigismund agreed to convert to Unitarianism. This itself was a first. In fact, it was a one and only. We have never before nor ever since been able to claim a Unitarian king. But then Sigismund did the second shocking thing that year, which is that he issued an edict. But it was not the staple edict that one would expect in those times, declaring that everyone is to be Unitarian from this day forth. Instead, the edict said this: His Majesty reaffirms that in every place the preacher shall preach and explain the gospel, each according to his understanding of it. And if the congregation like it, well, good. And if not, no one shall compel them, for their souls would not be satisfied. Instead, they shall be permitted to keep a preacher whose teaching they approve. Truly revolutionary. Now, while it would take another several centuries for the rest of Europe to follow suit, this was essentially the birth of a new era. Religious tolerance had come to the West. And it's a point of pride, I think, that our faith played a part in that. And whenever I recall this history, I remember the picture in Sunday school of Francis David giving his famous sermon in the Sigismund court. It is reprinted on the front of your order of service, and it proudly adorns the walls of many a Unitarian Universalist congregation. The tolerant proclamation has become a symbol of one of our key contributions to Western history. Tolerance. Tolerance had a noble and worthy beginning with the Edict of Torda and the Sigismund court. I do not think that there's any doubt about that. But after 450 years, it might be a good idea to ask whether tolerance is the best concept that we can use today when we encounter difference. And I would like to suggest this morning that there are some problems with the concept, problems that begin with the word itself. The etymological root of the word tolerance means to endure. We might think of how hospitals use the word tolerate. One tolerates pain. It is about accommodating something unpleasant and even destructive. It has not traditionally connoted celebration or acceptance. This actually matches the way that subsequent decrees of toleration have worked in various countries. These decrees are essentially about permission giving, but in very prejudicial ways. For example, when France began to allow the Protestant Huguenots to worship in public, the king set up all sorts of provisions. The houses of worship could not advertise. Their doors had to be pointed away from the main street. Huguenots had to pay a tithe to the Catholic Church, and they also had to observe Catholic holidays. Tolerance in that context was essentially an out-of-sight, out-of-mind ordeal as long as the minority faith remained invisible. It could exist, but it wasn't welcomed. To be clear, this was far, far better than the situation before tolerance. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But there was often an element of condescension and even humiliation attached to the concept of tolerance. This form of tolerance has not come to an end in modern times. As Germany was debating the question of marriage equality for gay and lesbian people, the socially conservative party joined under the slogan, "Tolerance, yes, marriage, no." Now, many liberals mocked them and said that this is not what tolerance means. But actually, it is much closer to the history of tolerance than the liberal critics would have liked to admit. Tolerance means allowing for the possibility of the survival of a minority while never granting equal rights. Now, I personally, as a gay man, have always been skeptical when tolerance has been used with respect to LGBTQ people. And it is precisely for this reason. When someone says that society needs to be more tolerant of LGBTQ people, it holds a subtle implication that something is wrong or different about them. There is something in their existence that needs to be endured by the majority. In this sense, the rhetoric of tolerance can actually become counterproductive, doing the opposite of what it intends. Rather than creating more acceptance, it can actually reinforce the minority as different, as other, as less than. We clearly need some sort of concept to guide us in our interactions in a diverse society. And for that, I would like to turn to one of the most celebrated and important activists around interfaith work that is working today, Eboo Patel. He was declared a faith advisor to President Obama in 2009. And he spoke at the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly in 2013. He also wrote 2 books, Acts of Faith and Stand Your Sacred Ground, both of which are excellent. Now, Bill George, the journalist, gives a sketch of Patel's life in a new U.S. News article, and he notes that Patel's passion for interfaith cooperation was shaped by childhood experiences that were anything but cooperative. A Muslim born in India, Patel grew up in Chicago, and when he ran for 7th grade student council, a white classmate told him, "Nobody would ever vote for people like you." Locker room humiliation and peer taunts of curry maker and worse marked his adolescence. In his searching memoir, Acts of Faith, he recalls the elements in his own background that might have led him to religious violence, a gut-wrenching feeling of being excluded from mainstream society, a vague sense of having the identity of Muslim, and a growing consciousness that people with whom he shared an identity were being horribly treated elsewhere, often by people who looked just like the ones who was bullying him here in the United States. He still feels the shame of not defending a Jewish friend by confronting a group of thugs who scrawled anti-Semitic slurs on a classroom locker. While studying at the University of Illinois, he recognized that his heroes, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Aga Khan, led through common principles of faith, although they practiced different faiths. And these early experiences with racism, with religious prejudice and rejection, caused Patel to question why religion causes such violence around the world. Why do some come to champion religious pluralism while others end up as suicide bombers? By digging deeply into his own life story, Patel recognized that the people and the programs that he had encountered had shaped his identity and that of other young people as well. He concluded that the only way to overcome destructive religious fanaticism is to create communities where human connection and learning about one another transcends differences of race, religion, and culture. And I quote him here, "I recognize now that believing in pluralism means having the courage to act upon it. Action is what separates belief from what is otherwise merely an opinion." In that spirit, he has created an organization that trains students on college campuses to become empowered advocates for religious pluralism. What Patel is doing begins with something more than tolerance, I think. In fact, if tolerance is about feeling someone else's difference as a burden and finding a way to live with it, Patel is advocating for something else entirely. I would like to suggest that the work that Patel is doing and the work that we might do here begins not with tolerance, but instead with curiosity. Begins with curiosity. It starts with an interest in learning about another's practices, beliefs, their cares and concerns, their life. And when we approach difference with what I would like to call this compassionate curiosity, we may well find that our own beliefs are challenged and changed and deepened. Even more importantly, we may discover the hopes and hurts and concerns of the people that we are working with. And in that proximity, we may begin to find that everyone has been changed. Alexander Argyles found that when he exercised curiosity about language, new worlds opened up to him. The same is true for when we do this with other people's religious traditions, their social locations, their ethnic backgrounds. Curiosity is harder than tolerance, I think. This is because it requires concentration and learning, and it also requires conversations with people that we would otherwise not normally come into conversation with. It is about getting close to people who are different than we are, rather than simply allowing them to exist over there. But this is the place precisely where new worlds begin to open up, where new possibilities emerge, where we do not simply endure difference, but are enriched and changed by difference. It's a place where we can become better people and perhaps create a kinder society. I think it is actually with compassionate curiosity that we will today enliven the spirit that began with the Edict of Torda. May it be so. My spiritual companions, amen. I love you. May yours be a day of healing and of gladness.